One of the most interesting parts of Breath of the Wild's gameplay is the ability to utilize different types of stat boosting equipment to overcome the world's challenges. Ever need to quickly climb up a large mountain in your way? Simple, use the climbing gear. Plan on sneaking up on a group of enemies to take them out? Just use a stealth potion. And a Lionel fight? Wouldn't hurt to throw on some attack boosting gear to make your time a bit easier. Bottom line, the stat boosting equipment in this game works wonders, and a great understanding of all these different buffs and how exactly they affect the player is key to mastering this game. Although there is one slight problem here. The game isn't exactly clear on how all these buffs affect the player, other than just stating which properties they change. Like, we know that an attack up buff increases player damage, but by how much exactly? A speed up buff may make the player run faster than usual, but how does this affect things like the speed of climbing and paragliding? And the Guardian resistance buff presumably protects the player more against Guardians, but how exactly is all this calculated? Since the large majority of the community is still left in the dark about how these buffs truly work, I thought it would be helpful to share my knowledge on this subject to hopefully help answer most of your guys' questions on this topic. Some of these stats are a bit more intricate than many of you may have originally expected, but by the end of the video, you should have a much greater understanding of how these stats work in order to utilize them as effectively as possible. Since there's going to be a ton of information presented in this video, it's perfectly understandable if you feel the need to take breaks or rewatch certain segments, as it's definitely going to be a lot to take in. Without further ado, let's get into all the hidden characteristics behind Breath of the Wild stat buffs. So to start us off, we first need to understand that the majority of these buffs come in 3 different levels of potency: level 1, level 2, and level 3. And there's no way to surpass the power of a level 3 buff in effectiveness. One common mistake I see a lot of players making is combining a full set of attack up armor with level 3 attack boosting food to get a higher damage output, when in reality, it still only counts as a level 3 buff and you're just wasting that extra meal. You are allowed to mix and match buffs between armor and food, like a level 2 attack buff in armor and a level 1 buff in food to create a buff of 3, but taking any more of the same type does not add to it in any way. On the flip side, you are allowed to have multiple different buffs applied at the same time, as each armor slot and your current buff through food can all be used for different things at once. I am currently using shock resistance boots, flame guard armor, a climber's bandana, and a stealth buff, all for the sake of this example, which is super goofy looking, but I can confirm that all these buffs do work in tandem. But with that clarification out of the way, how exactly do these buffs affect stats like attack output, speed, and the rest of them? Well, although this took a lot of testing for me to figure out, just about every buff in this game has their own distinct way of working. Some of them increase a stat by a set percentage value, while others change a whole characteristic about the player themselves. So in order to explain this all easiest, I'm going to break down all these stats into 3 distinct categories. The speed buffs, which include all buffs that increase movement speed, like climbing and swim speed up. The combat buffs, which include all types of attack and defense buffs, including things like ancient proficiency and guardian resistance. And finally, the elemental buffs, which include all types of weather resistance buffs such as heat and cold, and even the shock resistance buff as well. Just about every single buff in this game falls under one of these 3 categories, and for the few ones in this game that don't, such as stealth, we will save for the very end of this video. So to start us off, let's go over the speed buffs, which are honestly quite straightforward to explain. In this game, there are a total of 3 main buffs that contribute to boosting the player's movement speed. Climb speed up, which can be obtained via the climbing armor, swim speed up, which can be obtained on the Zora armor, and finally, the haste buff, which does both of these things along with boosting the player's running speed as well. And depending on which way you are currently traveling, the speed buff is calculated in a different way. Running with a level 1 speed buff applied will make the player 10% faster, level 2 makes them 20% faster, and a level 3 buff will make the player run 30% faster than usual. When climbing, the percentage rates are slightly better, with a level 1 buff boosting speed by 20%, level 2 by 30%, and level 3 all the way to 40%. And finally, the swim speed buffs, which are drastically more significant, boost swim speed by 30% with a level 1 buff, 60% with a level 2, and an insane 100% with a level 3 buff, which is literally double the speed. The way I tested all this information out is by traveling a set distance a total of 4 times, one without the buff and the other 3 with each one of the levels, so I can confirm that these stats are 100% accurate. However, as I stated earlier, there is no way to exceed the level 3 buff in effectiveness, as you cannot, for an example, stack a haste potion with the full Zora armor to increase your swim speed even further, as it only takes up to 3 levels. This also applies for the night speed up bonus that can be obtained on armors like the stealth. This by itself counts as a level 1 speed up buff when used in the nighttime, and can even combine with a level 2 speed buff to boost its effectiveness to 3, but cannot surpass that max movement boost in any way. However, there is one really unique detail that a lot of players look over when it comes to the speed buff, and that is how it handles stamina consumption for things like climbing and swimming. I'm sure that there was a time in your adventure when you thought that a mountain looked far too tall to climb with your current stamina meter, so you equipped some climbing gear or drank a speed potion to climb it faster, so your stamina wouldn't run out as quick. It seems logical because the faster you climb up a mountain, the less stamina you consume, but in reality, the game matches your stamina consumption to the speed that you are climbing at, which means that the speed buffs have literally no effect on the distance you can travel, only the climbing rate itself. However, the same is not true with the Zora armor, as any sort of waterworking speed buff makes a player go faster while consuming stamina at the same amount of speed. This is very helpful when trying to cross over large bodies of water, as there are certain distances that even a max stamina player cannot swim across without drowning, while a buff player can do so with ease. Other than that though, the speed buff has no other effect on things such as paragliding, shield surfing, or anything else movement related, so don't even bother drinking a speed potion if you plan on traveling any other way. But moving on, the next set of buffs to discuss, the attack and defense ones, are by far the most useful ones to understand, as they help wonders with improving your combat knowledge in this game. We will save the defense buffs for later, but for now, let's just start by focusing on the attack ones. In this game, there are a total of 3 main attack boosting buffs you can get: the standard attack up buff, bone attack up, and ancient proficiency. The standard attack up buff works very similarly to how the speed buffs did earlier, just with different percentage rates, as a level 1 buff can increase the player's damage output by 20%, a level 2 buff by 30%, and a level 3 buff by 50%. But unlike the previously mentioned buffs in this video, there are far more ways to increase the damage output in this game besides just using a standard attack buff. Bone Attack Up is a set bonus that can be found on the Radiant gear, which increases damage with all bone weapons you use, and Ancient Proficiency is a set bonus for the Ancient set that increases damage with all your ancient weaponry. But unlike the normal attack buffs that have multiple levels that go all the way to 50%, these two buffs only come in one potency level, and they both increase damage output with their respective weapons by a whopping 80%, which is incredible as is. But what makes this even better is that these buffs are allowed to stack on top of the standard attack up buff of 50% to increase damage output even further. Let's take a Guardian Axe++ for an example, which natively has a damage output of 60. If we were to just use the Ancient Proficiency buff with this, which buffs damage output by 80%, the damage output would be increased to 108, which is really good as is. But if we use an attack buff on top of this, the 50% damage buff gets stacked on top of the 108 to create a new damage output of 162, which is literally insane for a single weapon in this game. What's even better is that these buffs can stack even further with other types of damage boosting moves in this game, such as pulling off headshots, which do double damage, shattering frozen enemies, which do triple, and even pulling off sneak strikes, which do 8 times the normal damage. There's even a smaller attack up buff in this game called Master Sword Beam Up that increases the damage output of all Master Sword beams by 50%, meaning that the damage of an upgraded sword beam gets increased from 20 points to 30. So not too shabby, but it's actually the only way in the game you can increase the attack power of these beams, as the standard attack buff doesn't work with this move for some reason. However, with all the other unique ways you can multiply your player's damage outputs, there truly are so many possibilities for maxing out your character's combat potential in this game, that I may just make a separate video about it down the road. But moving away from the attack stats, let's now discuss the other half to this category, which are the defense stats, which include Guardian Resistance and the normal defense buff, that both alter the way the player receives damage in this game. But in order to understand how these defense buffs work, we first need a much clearer example on how this game handles base player health and armor rating, as these things are crucial to understand in order to explain how these buffs work on top of that. So be sure to pay attention, because this is all really important. So just like how enemies in this game have hit points that represent how much health they have left, the player's health works in the exact same way, but instead of being represented by a bar with numbers on it, they are represented by the hearts. Every heart to the player is equivalent to 4 HP, meaning that a quarter of a heart is equal to 1 HP. Knowing this, if we get struck by a silver bokoblin whom has an attack output of 24, we will lose 24 hit points or 6 hearts. However, this damage can be reduced down by using armor, by subtracting the number of armor points you have away from the enemy's damage output to lower the overall damage you take. In the same scenario, if we equip this upgraded Zora helm, which gives us an armor rating of 8, this subtracts 8 points away from the enemy's damage output of 24 to create 16, which only takes away 4 hearts of damage. So now that we have a better understanding of how hit points and armor work in this game, we can finally go over how the buffs influence these stats even further. Fortunately, the standard defense buff is by far the easiest to explain, as each level of the buff increases your armor rating by a fixed level. A level 1 buff will increase it by 4 points, a level 2 buff will increase it by 12 points, and a level 3 buff will increase it by 24 points, which all add to your current armor rating. So think of this buff as just adding additional pieces of armor to your character, as there is virtually no difference between getting armor points through this buff or through the armor itself. However, the Guardian Resistance buff can be used to decrease damage even further when facing off against all Guardian type enemies in this game. But instead of just giving out additional armor points like the defense buff, this one actually decreases your damage intake by a set percentage level, similarly to the attack buff. A level 1 buff will decrease damage input by 20%, a level 2 buff will decrease it by 30%, and a level 3 buff will decrease it all the way down to 50%. It's important to note though, that this percentage buff only gets calculated after the armor rating is already subtracted from the enemy's attack output, and not before. So when facing off against the Guardian Scouts with an axe that deals 60 damage per swing, while boasting an armor rating of 12 and a Guardian Resistance level of 1, the player will take 38 points of damage, or 9.5 hearts upon a swing. The way that this is calculated is by subtracting the 12 armor points away from the enemy's damage output of 60 to create 48, and then reducing that number by 20% to create 38. Since Guardian enemies are among some of the heaviest hitters in the game, having a buff like this is extremely helpful in preserving your health bar as much as possible. But other than that, that's basically all there is to go over when it comes to the combat related buffs in this game. I know that was a lot to take in, but I promise that things are only going to get simpler from here, as the next set of stats to discuss, the elemental ones, are a lot easier to understand. I feel that most of the temperature related buffs in this game are rather self-explanatory, as they simply prevent a player from rapidly losing hearts in areas with extreme temperature, such as snowy biomes, the desert, or the volcanic region. In these areas, there are 2 different types of temperature intensity that can be experienced. Low intensity, which requires a level 1 buff to be negated, and high intensity, which requires a level 2. Areas like Mount Hylia on the Great Plateau, for an example, possess a low temperature intensity and only require a level 1 buff, while bigger snowy areas like the Hebra and Highland regions require a level 2. However, there are a few different methods to change a player's resistance to temperature that don't necessarily take the form of a buff. For an example, carrying an ice elemental weapon in hot areas like the desert works the exact same way as a level 1 heat resistance buff, which can even stack with any other means of heat protection such as a potion or armor to get the max efficiency. Same works in the snowy areas with a flame elemental weapon as well. But what most people don't know is that any sort of open flame in a snowy biome acts the same as a level 2 cold resistance buff as long as you are near it. This counts for campfires, lit torches and weapons, and even just keeping a burning arrow on you, despite not being the most effective way to travel. But other than that, there really isn't much to explain about the temperature related buffs, as it's rather self-explanatory. But the final elemental buff, shock resistance, may come off as a bit of a shock to you, because unlike a normal level 3 stat buff that will boost a stat by a set percentage, having a level 3 shock buff will make you completely immune to just about all electrical base attacks in the game. Things such as lightning orbs from thunder rods and electrical spears from enemies will completely phase right through the player without taking any damage or disarming them, which is super helpful in areas where electrical based enemies typically roam. Elemental weapons like thunder arrows and blades will still do damage to the player upon a strike, but they will only take damage from the weapon itself, and not the elemental factor, which is all very similar to how the unfreezable and fireproof set bonuses work as well, just with different elements. However, the only way you can protect yourself from something like a lightning blast is by getting the unshockable set bonus on this gear, otherwise it will still destroy the player upon a strike. This is why the Thunder Helm is still a far more effective item than the rubber armor, as it gives a player a level 3 shock buff and lightning immunity as well, so it completely supplements all of its effectiveness in a single item. Other than that though, we have basically covered just about every buff that can be found in this game. There are only a few miscellaneous ones we have yet to discuss that couldn't fit into any of the other categories, so I'll try to explain each of them briefly before we wrap up the video. The stealth buff helps reduce a player's noise when moving around, whether that be from walking or crouching, and each buff level decreases the player noise greater than the last. This is really important when sneaking up on enemies, because if your player exceeds a certain level of sound when moving around, the enemies will become alerted of your presence, which is almost never an issue at all with the high level stealth buff. Just make sure to avoid line of sight with an enemy, as they will still be able to spot you if you are in their cone of vision, despite how high your stealth buff may be. But beyond this, every other buff that we haven't mentioned yet doesn't really require any sort of big explanation to go over, as they are rather self-explanatory. The Disguise Up buff prevents the player from being seen by stall-based enemies, the Charge Up buff reduces stamina consumption on all charge attacks by half, and so on. However, there are a few items in this game that actually boast hidden stat bonuses without even outright telling the player. The Ancient Circlet, for an example, has a miniature version of the Ancient Proficiency buff that increases attack output with all ancient weapons by 20%. And the Island Lobster shirt significantly increases raft speed when using a Korok leaf, which makes traveling by water a much more viable means of transportation than it is without it. But in conclusion, that is everything I have to discuss when it comes to the hidden characteristics of stat buffs in this game. I really hope that all this information has helped you understand the fuller meaning behind all of these stats, and hopefully you'll be able to apply this knowledge usefully next time you sit down and play this game. It honestly took me a crazy amount of time to do the research in the game to figure all this information out, but if you happen to find another hidden characteristic about these buffs that I happen to miss, feel free to leave it in the comments below. But anyways, thank you all so much for watching. I am so proud to announce that my channel has finally hit the 10,000 subscriber milestone on YouTube. It's crazy to think that just over a week ago, I was celebrating my 7,000 milestone. So all your guys' recent support has been honestly quite mesmerizing, and I truly can't thank you all enough. I plan on getting a lot more Breath of the Wild related content like this out in the weeks to follow. So definitely feel free to leave a like here and subscribe if you haven't already so you won't miss any future videos to come. Also, a huge shout out to my amazing patrons and YouTube members for supporting the channel. If you would like to help me out here for as little as $1 a month, all the info can be found in the description below. Anyways, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.